Welcome to Asia Pacific Defence Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. I'll start with a couple of quick corrections from the previous podcast and who picked up on the deliberate mistake I made in the first of those. I referred to CEA radars on the Hobart-class frigates to be delivered in 2033. This is in fact the Hunter-class frigates that are currently under construction in Adelaide. And the other much more consequential thing that I got completely wrong was the enthusiasm, the desperate rush of Australian politicians to support the US and Israeli attacks on Iran. That's both the government and the coalition. And I now note a very recent development that Donald Trump is calling on various countries to contribute naval forces to fix a problem entirely of his own making, namely that the Straits of Hormuz are closed to most tanker traffic. By the way, the president has started calling the attacks an excursion. I have no idea why, but that's the word of the day. And this is, the events are based on an outright lie, namely that Iran was a week away from attacking the US. This is total nonsense, a complete fabrication. Our government knows it, because even if Iran wanted to attack the US, they don't have any weapons capable of going that far. Yes, hypothetically, they might have been able to attack some US bases in the region, but there is absolutely no evidence that they were planning to do so. But before we get into that, I just have to mention for me another high priority item that's received little coverage in this country. It's another blow to transparency when it comes to finding out what is happening with mismanaged defence projects. On the 6th of March, the Parliamentary Joint Committee of Public Accounts and Audit resolved to no longer request that the Audit Office and the Department of Defence produce a report into major defence projects. Now, this is an appalling development, very much further down the path of no transparency at all. It comes on top of the Department of Defence increasingly classifying project data as, in quote marks, not for publication on security grounds. And in the previous annual report, the final one, the ANAO noticed that the department used this gimmick of not for publication to withhold information for 20 out of 21 major projects. It's the end of an era. It's been an extraordinarily useful tool for journalists. This is a process that's been underway for 18 years. It's now been scrapped. This is obviously to the delight of the government, and in particular to Ministers Marles and Conroy, because it means that the public, the media, will know even less about how badly projects are going off the rails. To return to the Middle Eastern war, which is continuing to dominate the headlines, I thought the government would be a bit more circumspect and thoughtful about it, but not a bit. In fact, as my previous podcast was being released, the announcement was made of the deployment of a Wedgetail AEW&C aircraft to the Middle East, to the UAE, and also some AMRAAM missiles being either sold or donated to the UAE. And I said I thought it was unlikely we would send ground-based air defence systems, a thing called NASAMs, because they use AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles as their main weapon. I got that totally wrong. But for me, it raises the question, why can't the UAE get them from the United States? Why do they need them from Australia? Now, if I've got time, I might have a bit more to say about the dynamics of the Gulf states and the eventual outcome of these attacks on Iran. I don't think that the outlook is potentially as rosy as Australian politicians are hoping for. Anyway, the deployment of Wedgetail, the aircraft, nothing particularly controversial about that. It has the potential to make an important contribution to the sort of the air battle. detecting incoming Iranian drones, vectoring aircraft and missile batteries to destroy them before they hit their targets, all of that sort of thing. But I do note that the Wedgetail, as far as I'm aware, is going to be based at the Al Minhad Air Base. This is a long-standing base for ADF operations. It's been the ADF headquarters location in the Middle East since 2003, but it's already come under a drone attack from Iran. No Australian personnel were injured. Let's hope the Wedgetail isn't hit by an Iranian drone. Let's hope it's safely undercover. But let's have a think about, why did Australia rush in with such enthusiasm? And this is also from Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, who was previously very proud of Labor's decision to oppose Australia's involvement in the 2003 invasion of Iraq. But now that he's in the driving seat, he has been rushing to support another US Middle Eastern operation that could end disastrously. So let's have a quick look at the timeline. And this has to do partly, I believe, with the Iranian soccer players, the women, seeking asylum here. And Trump posted a negative comment about Australia not taking them at 1 a.m., 1 o'clock in the morning, on Tuesday, March the 10th. Now, we know that at 2 a.m., an hour later, in the middle of the night, Donald Trump is given the message that the Australian Prime Minister wishes to speak with him. He calls. Trump is known to speak uninterrupted, so presumably the Australian Prime Minister had only time to explain that Australia had decided to give asylum to some Iranian women. He then presumably had 39 minutes of Trump about how the 2020 election was stolen and all of that sort of stuff. Now, then at 10 a.m., 8 hours later, obviously still spooked by the initial negative Trump Truth Social post, the National Security Cabinet, in a desperate attempt to make Trump happy, agrees to publicly send the E-7 Wedgetails and the AMRAAM missiles. As I say, I'm not surprised by Wedgetail, but given the limited number of AMRAAMs, that should raise eyebrows. Now, it has been put to me from a well-informed source that the RAF AMRAAMs are an older version of the missile that will be replaced, but the ones that we're sending will still be effective against cruise missiles and drones. However, the resupply of those missiles, I think, is going to be a very important issue for Australia and other US allies. The government tells us that Australia's contribution is purely defensive, which of course is total nonsense. I can't imagine that we have any say, having donated these missiles, that they can only be used to protect Australian citizens in the Gulf states. Once you hand them over, it will be the UAE Air Force that will be making decisions about how they are used. I note that the government's concern for Australian citizens, as laudable as it is, doesn't seem to extend to those currently stuck in South Lebanon who are facing yet another Israeli invasion. Now, I don't think that Labor support for this war seems to be particularly thought through, and I'll elaborate on two specific problem areas. The first one is obviously rising fuel prices, and Australians will soon be connecting the dots. Prices going up the bowser. The government is supporting the US actions making the prices go up. That's a fairly simple link that could hurt the government. That they are protected to an extent because the coalition is also supportive of this. But anyway, government decisions causing prices to go up. But another potential negative consequence, which I've seen no coverage of this at all, is the government is getting offside with US Democrats, the Democratic Party, who strongly oppose what Trump is doing. And I'll circle back to that in a moment. But what really concerns me a lot more is Australia going along with a potentially apocalyptic scenario of some form of ground invasion of Iran. And if you don't think this could happen, you would be making a big mistake. And that's because there are plenty of religious fanatics in powerful positions in both the US and Israel who are lobbying for direct action against Iran, saying the time has come to fix the problem of the Islamic Revolution that has been around for 47 years. And people like Senator Lindsey Graham, who has the ear of President Trump when Graham can sober up, he is already very loudly declaring this to be a religious war. I've commented before that the Secretary of Defense, or the Secretary of War, the comical character of Pete Hegseth, who talks as if he believes Rambo was a real person and not a movie character. He is an open Christian nationalist and is another driver of the bombing campaign who might be interested in doing a whole lot more than that. There are people in Israeli politics who likewise have a complete hatred of Iran and who talk of a greater Israel annexing not just the West Bank, but some or all of Lebanon. Now, it's entirely possible that many of the people involved in this, in the US and Israel, believe their own propaganda that an invasion, a ground invasion of Iran, would trigger a popular uprising that would sweep the clerics from power. I'm far from certain about that. It's a loathsome regime, no question about that, as we've discussed previously, but an invasion could have the opposite effect of a sort of rally around the flag, as I suspect the ongoing aerial bombardment is having. Turning to US politics and the attitude of the Democrats, I'm going to quote from Congressman Joe Courtney, who is well known to many Australians because he is the joint chair of the sort of Americans for Australia support group. This is a direct quote from him speaking in Congress, saying, "The Trump administration's failure to answer basic questions about what imminent threat to the US homeland justifies spending blood and treasure to go to war with Iran, and the egregious failure to provide protection for the tens of thousands of service members in the region, and, most importantly, to describe a coherent plan for success, scream out for Congress to reassert its constitutional authority." He says a war powers resolution by Congress is the best opportunity to restore some checks and balances, to restore some constitutional authority over the process, Congress having the authority to declare war. I would have thought that the government so quickly siding with Trump is certainly going to be an irritant to Courtney and the other Democrats who are doing their best to rein in a rogue president. Personally, I don't think the Democrats will ever return to power because Trump and the Republicans will find a number of ways to rig the outcome of the November midterm elections, and after that, it's goodnight US democracy. But if I'm wrong, and it's possible that I am, the Democrats could resent Australia's unquestioning slavish attachment to Trump. I mean, I would, but maybe I'm just mean-spirited when it comes to things like that. So if I were the next Democrat president or the Secretary of Defense or State, I would be thinking, hang on, when Trump started these attacks on Iran, the UK pushed back, at least initially, denying the US use of bases. France said that they objected. Spain went even further and were openly critical. But hang on, what did the Australians do? Let's check, let's think. Why? They were slobbering all over Trump's boots, enthusiastically supporting everything that he was doing. Anyway, we'll see how that plays out. Now, another feature in all of this, which I did previously mention, but it's worth restating, is the big winner in all of this, namely Russia, because he's lifted sanctions on Russian oil, and that is billions and billions of dollars, trillions of rubles, into President Putin's coffers to pay for his ongoing disastrous war on Ukraine. And some Trump apologists have said, well, it's a 30-day period for the lifting of sanctions. I suspect it's just going to roll on. In fact, Ukrainian conspiracy theorists, and I haven't gone that far, they suspect that the whole thing, the bombing of Iran, was cooked up by Trump and Putin for precisely this reason, to spike oil prices and so that Russia could get some sanctions relief. Now, also, as a bit of a digression, decided that it's worth a few words on the government's support for the UAE. It's a small country made up of 7 emirates, and the only thing, frankly, that gives it any importance is money, and they have a lot of it. The total population of the UAE is about 11 million, of whom 80% are expats. So the total number of actual Emiratis is a bit less than 2 million. I've been to the UAE twice, once for a 3-day stopover in Dubai on my way to Europe, and that's 3 days of my life that I'll never get back, since I'm not into air-conditioned shopping malls. And then much more productively, I was there for about a week, visiting the company called Edge, that I've previously mentioned. Edge came about because of the UAE's use of offsets, a policy Australia very foolishly discarded about 30 years ago, which meant that the companies they were buying stuff from had a legal obligation to invest substantial amounts of money in the UAE. Now, this created a situation where the government owned about, from memory, 20 disparate but mainly very high-tech facilities producing everything from small arms through to guided weapons, some shipbuilding, and a lot of cyber technology. So a decision was made to gather all of these things together in one entity and to look for synergies and further investments. That one entity is this thing called Edge. So while Australian defence industry struggles with boom-bust cycles and a lack of major exports, as far as I can tell, Edge is doing very well. And this is yet another example of having a coherent industry policy that Australia could learn from. What else can I say about the UAE? Their treatment of women is reasonably good, especially compared with other Middle Eastern hellholes such as Iran. However, their treatment of journalists is very poor, with no criticism of the government or the royal family permitted. If a journalist in the UAE recorded podcasts such as this one, or wrote editorials in the way that I write them, they would be in jail. Also, for a small country, it can't resist interfering in the business of other nations. It is a major player in the chaos and anarchy that used to be known as Libya, and at the moment, the UAE is giving military support and a lot of money to the main faction opposed to the other faction that the UN recognizes as the legitimate government of the country. The UAE was also backing one of the anti-Houthi factions in Yemen until last December, when supposed close ally and neighbour Saudi Arabia bombed one of their arms delivery ships, which prompted the UAE to pull out of that disastrous ongoing conflict. Putting all that together, I'm not really sure why Australia and the UAE are such close friends, but we've signed a strategic partnering agreement with them in October last year, which does things like eliminate almost all tariffs, looking at you, Donald Trump. Anyway, I'm going to wrap up. The clock is ticking. Hotel Kingston Friday lunchtime rumours. The C3000 contract for Megami frigates might not be signed by the end of March, which ministers Marles and Conroy were totally obsessed about last year, meeting that deadline, but something else might happen, some sort of face-saving agreement. I have heard from other sources that it's on track, so we'll keep on watching that one. And the other rumour is the government is close to an announcement about rocket motor production in Australia. This is an important component of the GWIO. Let's hope that it does happen soon. The two companies most favoured are L3Harris and Anduril, though these are industry rumours rather than leaks from within the department, so treat with caution. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye for now, and see you next time.
That's today's Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.